Charlotte Hayes learned to count in 8 counts, not tens. Plié, tendu, rond de jambe, the quiet grammar of ballet, stitched into a childhood lived beside a salt-bitten lighthouse. The town called Brightwater was the kind of place that salted your hair and your secrets. Everyone knew Charlotte as the girl who moved like a held breath and kept to herself like a sealed letter. Lucas Bennett knew her as something else. To him, she was the only witness to the way his voice cracked when his mother died, the one who taught him how to double knot his grief and keep walking. They were a pair of mismatched shoes, Charlotte all softness and structure, Lucas a boy already measuring the horizon with an entrepreneur's eye. At 14, they carved their initials into the lighthouse railing and made a pact, never to lie to each other and never to let the town decide who they were. Life, of course, had other choreography. Lucas left after high school with a scholarship and an appetite for the larger map. Charlotte stayed, choosing a studio that smelled of rosin and seaweed, teaching small bodies how to listen to music without interrupting it. Letters turned into texts, texts into the occasional holiday call. The thread never broke, it just thinned. On the afternoon the foghorn went silent. A maintenance day, the keeper said. The town felt too quiet, as if held under water. Charlotte finished class, locked the studio, and found a black car idling by the curb, like a period at the end of a sentence. Lucas stepped out wearing a city that didn't quite fit in Brightwater. His face had the fine-boned handsomeness of a man who had learned to be photographed, but his eyes were still the same messy blue. They hugged the way people do when they are measuring what time is taken and what it has spared. "Walk?" he asked. They took the boardwalk to the lighthouse, climbing until the wind performed its old trick of cleaning out the lungs. He told her about the company he'd built, logistics made elegant, money made obedient. She told him about the foundation class finally nailing their first clean diagonal. Their words felt like rinsed stones, smooth, familiar. He was quiet when they reached the railing with their carved initials. "I came because I need something I can't buy," he said, voice barely louder than the wind. "I want family, Charlotte. Not an heir for headlines, just a child who begins in trust. I don't love the way people mean it in songs. I've tried, and it didn't fit. But I believe in you more than I believe in any deal I've ever signed. Would you have a child with me?" The sky was a scrim of gulls. Charlotte's first feeling wasn't shock, but vertigo, like stepping to the edge of a stage and discovering there's no orchestra pit, only sky. She remembered their pact. Never lie. She said, "I don't know, but I won't pretend I didn't hear you." Behind them, the lighthouse lamp turned lazily, throwing a slow coin of light across water. Somewhere below, the town shifted, unknowing. Charlotte felt the old rhythm rise, plié, tendu, her body finding balance where her mind could not. She said, "Walk me home. We'll talk on the way." They went down together, not as lovers, not yet as co-conspirators, but as the two children who had once promised to tell the truth, even when it complicated everything.
They made tea like diplomats, measured, cautious. Charlotte set out honey. Lucas ignored it until he remembered he was human and not a press release. The question sat between them, warm as steam. "Say the word and I'll leave it alone," he said. "I won't turn this into an acquisition." "I'm not an asset," she said gently, "and a child isn't a goal." She surprised herself with a smile. "But you knew that, or you wouldn't have come here instead of hiring a lawyer." He flinched, not at the word lawyer, but at hired. "I didn't come to buy anything. I came to ask the only person I trust to share the ground under my feet." They spent 3 evenings listing fears as if mapping a coastline. Charlotte feared being reduced to a headline or a womb. Lucas feared the blind corners of his own loneliness. Charlotte feared losing the quiet of her life, the sweetness of her work, the certainty that her body belonged only to her. Lucas feared the way money attracts people who love it more than they love you. On the fourth night, she wrote 3 conditions on the back of a recital program. 1. They would move forward only if both could say yes without bargaining against themselves. 2. The friendship must be preserved as the floor they stood on, no matter what walls or doors they added. 3. Love, whatever shape it wanted, had to be present in every choice, not just the convenient ones. If any of these crack, she said, we stop. Lucas read the list as if it were a term sheet for a company he couldn't afford to lose. I can sign this with my name, he said, but it will mean nothing if I don't also sign with my days. He rented a house in Brightwater that didn't try to impress anyone and learned the names of her students. He arrived with coffee at dawn and learned to sweep rosin from wood floors. He listened while she spoke about hips and hamstrings, how the smallest adjustment can save a dancer from a future injury. So much of life is avoiding the big pain by attending to the small ones, she said. He nodded like a man learning a new language. They tried a rehearsal, cohabiting without pretending, practicing the cadence of mornings and nights. Lucas cooked badly and improved. Charlotte labeled spices with tape and a black marker. On Sundays, they walked to the lighthouse, not to solve anything, but to hold the ritual that had held them. The town began to talk, as it always did, but gossip landed like hail and melted on their porch. One night a storm pinned the windows. The power went out and they sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing a blanket that smelled like laundry detergent and sea air. I don't know what kind of love I have, he said into the dark. It isn't fireworks. It's more like a harbor. Everything else in my life is windward. You feel like lee. Harbor. The word loosened something inside her, a knot she hadn't known she tied. Charlotte reached for his hand, not with heat, but with recognition. Then we'll build the rest like a dock, plank by plank. No performance, just weight and wood and time. The lights returned. The storm didn't notice. Neither did the sea. But a blueprint had been sketched, terms of a tender war where both sides planned to win together. When they finally kissed, it wasn't a beginning or an end. It was a promise to stay long enough for both.
They approached intimacy as students and teachers, awkward and honest. Charlotte taught him basics most people never name, how consent isn't a once, but a chorus, how desire can be shy, how her body listened better when it didn't feel watched. Lucas, used to mastering systems, learned to delight in not mastering this one. When his impatience surfaced, he named it and put it down like a tool he didn't need. Their first attempt to conceive failed, their second, too. They did the math wrong, then the medicine right, then nothing at all, except tenderness. It would have been easy to let urgency corrode them, to turn their bodies into instruments. Instead, they added other measures. They cooked together, took a community class on infant CPR, read aloud from children's books at night, and laughed at the way adults smuggle philosophy into pages about bears and porridge. Sometimes Charlotte woke afraid of what motherhood might take. Time from the girls who needed her. Solitude from the dancer inside her who still wanted to work in silence. Lucas woke afraid of what fatherhood might expose, his need to control what could not be controlled. They spoke these fears in the kitchen, the car, walking home from the lighthouse. The act of saying them turned monsters into neighbors. Brightwater had its commentators. Mrs. Kinney, who owned the bakery, called their arrangement modern, the way people say weather. A former classmate posted a photo of them buying baby books and captioned it with winking emojis that did not land gently. Charlotte found that people preferred love they could sing along to. What they were building did not have a chorus yet, only verses. In the studio, her students learned a new combination: fall and recover, fall and recover. It's not about never falling, Charlotte told them. It's about training the floor and your muscles to meet each other with less fear. After class, a little boy named Eli asked if grown-ups practiced that too. Every day, she said. One evening, they slowed down. No schedule, no thermometers, no apps. They put on a record and let the room fill with an old song, whose singers sounded like rain learning a melody. Their bodies found each other with patience, reflections of a lighthouse beam circling the same stretch of sea and discovering it new each pass. There was laughter when they bumped noses, tenderness when Charlotte guided his hand, relief when they didn't have to be perfect to be sincere. After, they lay listening to the late train fold the town into its sound. Charlotte felt her heart soft in her ribs, like something finally allowed to enter a room it had been pacing outside. "Whatever happens," she said into his shoulder, "we already built something." Lucas kissed her hair. "We can keep building," he said, "even if the blueprint changes." When sleep came, it came the way morning fog does. Not sudden, but all at once when you realize you are inside it. Out beyond the dark window, the sea rehearsed its single line. On the nightstand, the recital program with their 3 conditions lay under the weight of a glass, protected but visible, like a vow.
2 weeks later, Charlotte mistook fatigue for a long day until the smell of coffee turned her stomach into a wave. She laughed at herself on the way to the pharmacy, a laugh that sounded like hope trying on shoes. Back home, she stared at the plastic wand the way a sailor reads sky. Lucas stood in the doorway, attempting nonchalance and failing. They waited together on the bathroom floor, tile cold under their knees, hands braided so tightly their knuckles weighed a small chorus. When the second line appeared, Charlotte didn't cry. She exhaled, and the room changed shape. Lucas's face did something complicated: relief, awe, a fear that told the truth about how wildly he wanted this. They stood and held each other, as if bracing a wall and also as if opening one. News moved through Brightwater with the efficiency of wind. Charlotte imagined headlines that didn't exist, prepared statements no one had asked for. Instead, she returned to class. Her body felt like a letter she had mailed to an unknown future, and also still her own. She choreographed a new piece for the older students, a pas de deux that refused clichés, where the lifts were steady and the landings soft. The town reacted in registers. Mrs. Kinney cried into a bag of sugar. A fisherman at the pier told Lucas he was lucky to love a woman who knew what mattered. An aunt who wasn't an aunt warned Charlotte that children anchor women while men sail deeper waters. Charlotte bought bait at the pier and took Lucas fishing to celebrate being nobody's cautionary tale. Pregnancy introduced Charlotte to a new humility. Her balance shifted. Muscles she trusted like old friends requested patience. She discovered the hilarity of needing to pee 5 minutes after insisting she did not. She told her students the truth. Bodies change, and dance is the art of changing with them rather than against them. They watched her with bright eyes, learning that strength can look like adjustment. At night, she and Lucas made lists: pediatricians, lullabies, names they could live with. They said them aloud, tasting each for its music. Lorenzo, Lucas offered once, shy with it because it had been his grandfather's. Enzo, Charlotte said, smiling at the way the name flicked like a wing. Not all conversations were blessed. A former investor texted Lucas a link to an article about succession, as if a child were a corporate strategy.
He silenced the thread and took Charlotte's hand. "We're not a story for other people to tell," he said. Storm season returned. It was as if the sea needed to express on their behalf what they were refusing to dramatize. On a night of particular thunder, Charlotte woke anxious and went to the lighthouse alone, ascending slowly, stopping when the stairs reminded her of her new center of gravity. At the top, wind tore her hair loose. She spoke out loud, to the water, to the child the size of a blueberry, to the girl she could been. "I am not afraid," she said, testifying not to her feelings but to her decision. When she descended, Lucas was at the bottom step, soaked, wordless. He didn't scold her for going, he offered his jacket. They walked home tapping out the beat of the rain on their shoulders, two actors in a scene that could have been melodrama, and refused it, choosing instead the difficult art of being ordinary together.
The second trimester was a rehearsal for joy. Charlotte's energy returned like a forgiven friend. She taught with new precision, finding metaphors in her shifting posture. Arabesque now feels like writing on the air with a heavier pen. It's the same word, just thicker ink. Her students adored these quirky sayings and wrote them on the whiteboard like spells. Lucas, who had always managed crises with elegant spreadsheets, learned slower arts, building a crib, folding very small shirts, attending prenatal appointments, and asking questions that began with, "How does this feel for you?" rather than, "What's the plan?" He installed a dimmer switch in the nursery and took too long choosing a rocking chair, the way a man admits he is building a future by fussing over the tools that will hold it. They planned not a birth, but a beginning. Charlotte wanted music that did not try to manipulate her, piano pieces that sounded like people thinking kindly. Lucas wanted a bag packed 2 weeks early and a route to the hospital that avoided the ice cream shop, where traffic exploded every summer afternoon. They agreed they would forgive themselves if everything changed once everything began. Meanwhile, Brightwater kept being Brightwater. The town parade asked Charlotte to serve as a judge. She accepted and waved with a hand that would soon cradle. An op-ed in the local paper argued that traditional families are the town's lighthouse, a metaphor so tired even the lighthouse might have shrugged. A week later, a teenager wrote a response about how ships also read the stars. One evening, an email arrived from a dance therapy program in Chicago. Charlotte had applied months before on a dare she whispered only to herself. The message was bright with invitation, a fellowship, a chance to build community-based movement programs for trauma recovery. She read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition could shrivel the reality. Chicago was a far shore. Her life was here. Lucas found her sitting on the floor, back against the hallway wall, phone face down. "Good news or bad?" She said, "Yes." They took a walk to the lighthouse because that is where they went to tell the truth. "I don't want to drag you into my dream," she said. "I also don't want to shrink to fit the edges of yours." He looked at the water, which answered nobody. He said, "I don't love you the way a poet would write it, but I think love might be the name for the thing that makes me want your life to be big, even if it makes mine complicated." "Are you saying you'd move?" He said, "I'm saying I'd like to learn how to be portable." He said, a businessman practicing the art of surrender. They didn't decide that night. They stood until the light circled them twice and went home to wash dishes, which is another way to think. But a path had opened, not away from Brightwater, but through it, like a channel cut by tide.
Decisions are less like doors and more like weather fronts. You feel the shift before you see it. By late August, the fellowship's start date approached like a train you could hear long before it arrived. Charlotte accepted. The word yes tasted like courage and fear milled together. Packing a life turned out to be an archaeology of the unremarkable. A jar of sand from a forgotten beach day, ticket stubs, the first pair of ballet slippers she'd bought with her own paycheck, their satin grayed into humility. Lucas handed logistics, The lease, the moving truck, the insurance, with the calm of a man resolving a puzzle. He also went quiet some evenings, as if practicing a grief he didn't yet know by name. When she touched his wrist in those moments, he turned his hand over and opened his palm. Brightwater threw them a potluck, disguised as a goodbye. Eli's mother brought pie. Mrs. Kinney baked a cake shaped like a lighthouse and pretended it was an accident. "We'll keep your class going," the parents promised. And Charlotte believed them, because communities are also boats. They float what you load into them if enough hands agree to lift. On their last night, they climbed the lighthouse alone, carrying 2 mugs of tea and a pocket knife. They found their initials, faded by time and weather. Lucas added a small star, not to overwrite the past, but to mark the chapter change. "We are not the first to leave and love a place," Charlotte said. The wind wrote agreement across their faces. The road to Chicago unspooled like a ribbon untying a gift. They drove in shifts, Lucas marveling at flatlands, Charlotte humming to the baby who responded with private gymnastics. They spoke about money with seriousness and humor, about how 2 careers would dance around a child, about the difference between sacrifice and exchange. "Compromise is when both people lose something," Charlotte said. "Trade is when both get something they want. Let's be traders." In Chicago, the air smelled less of salt and more of motion. Their apartments at 2 floors above a laundromat that sang on weekends. The fellowship occupied Charlotte's mornings and some evenings. The rest belonged to the program she designed from scratch, movement as a soft tool for hard stories. Participants showed up wary and left with shoulders lower. Lucas found office space and realized that logistics didn't care where he lived, only how he listened. They missed Brightwater like a limb, but missing doesn't mean mistake. They found a new lighthouse, a steel and glass library where light pooled on the floor and made quiet possible. They learned new grocery stores and the names of corners where traffic disobeyed the rules. At night they lay in the hum of the city and gave thanks without ceremony. One early morning, sky the color of newsprint, Charlotte woke to a steady rhythm not her own. It took a moment to understand. Her body had begun without asking permission. She shook Lucas awake. He blinked, smiled, stood and spoke into the room like a man talking to a storm he was honored to host. "Okay." They left the apartment not as people escaping a scene, but as a pair carrying a future down the stairs, 1 step at a time, pausing on the landing because the contraction said pause. Outside, the laundromat doors swung open, and the owner, who had learned their names without fuss, stepped aside like a priest. The city received them without commentary. The hospital smelled like lemon and effort. The day tilted toward its necessary brightness. Labor is a verb that refuses metaphor. It is, itself, work with a holiness that does not ask for applause. Charlotte let the world narrow to breath, to the way Lucas's hand became a rope she could pull, to the memory of rehearsals where counting saved you from chaos. The nurses learned quickly that she liked quiet. The doctor learned quickly that Lucas could translate her eyes. Hours rearranged themselves. Pain arrived and left like a tide, respecting no clock. Between waves, Charlotte saw flashes, the lighthouse, Eli's gap-toothed grin, her mother sewing a ribbon on new slippers, Lucas on the bathroom floor counting to 300 without breaking once. "You're doing it," he said, and she knew he meant both the birth and the life. When the baby came, he came with a cry so ordinary and so exact that Charlotte laughed while she cried. The room changed again, as rooms must when a person arrives. Lucas made a sound she had never heard, something that might have been a prayer if he were a praying man. They placed the baby on her chest, and the meeting did not feel cinematic. It felt right, like a key finally remembering the lock it had been shaped for. "Welcome," she whispered. "We'll make this up as we go." The nurse asked the name as if inviting them to seal a spell. Charlotte looked at Lucas, who was already looking at her. "Lorenzo," they said together.
surprised and not surprised at all. Enzo opened his eyes as if to approve the minutes-old democracy of his parents. The days that followed were a collage of astonishment and logistics, swaddling, the complicated origami of buckles on a car seat, sleep becoming a currency to be traded with interest. Lucas's board voted without him and survived. Charlotte's cohort covered her sessions with a tenderness that felt like scaffolding. Visitors came in waves, some loud, some carrying soup that understood more than words. At 3 in the morning on day 5, the city hummed like a hive. Enzo slept on Lucas's chest, small as a promise kept. "Do you regret any of it?" Lucas asked into the half-dark. Charlotte thought of Brightwater, of gossip, of the fellowship, of the stairs they had climbed because there was no elevator. She thought of the 3 conditions on the recital program and how they had signed their names with days. "No," she said. "And also, sometimes yes for 5 minutes, but the no wins every time." He nodded. "I don't know how to be a father," he said. "You're already doing it," she answered, "because truth given gently is still truth." When the dawn dripped like thin paint across the blinds, Enzo stirred. Lucas looked down in awe and terror renewed. Charlotte stood, sore and strong. She felt the line between who she had been and who she was now, and she chose not to draw it fierce. Continuity, she decided, is also courage. They went home. The laundromat sang. The city continued not to care, and in that indifference offered a strange kindness, the freedom to be fully themselves without the burden of being symbolic for anyone else.
The year turned like a page. Enzo learned to roll, then to sit, then to reach for the cat with a diplomacy that improved weekly. Charlotte returned to the studio part-time and expanded the therapy program, using scarves and silence and rhythms that made room for grief without drowning in it. Lucas split his calendar between investors who loved the sound of their own certainty and afternoons on the floor, building block cities that broke all zoning laws. They married without spectacle, in a courthouse that smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil. Charlotte wore a white dress because she liked it, not because the day required it. Lucas wore a suit he'd had tailored for boardrooms and decided it looked better holding his son. After they signed, they took Enzo for pancakes, a sacrament the child accepted with both hands. Brightwater sent a card the size of a window. It was signed by so many hands the names ran uphill and over each other. "Visit when you can," Mrs. Kinney had written. "We'll leave the light on." The lighthouse did not belong to them, but it remained theirs the way your childhood does, not as property, but as weather. On their first trip back, they stood at the railing and found the star Lucas had carved. Enzo slept in a carrier against Charlotte's chest, drooling on the strap with the intensity of the very young. A teenager practicing skateboard tricks nearby called out, "Sick, baby," which Charlotte understood was praise. Lucas laughed in a way that unknotted a long-held tension. They were not a scandal. They were not a sermon. They were a family on a windy day. At night, back in the guest room of Charlotte's old studio, they lay awake listening to the building settle. "I used to be afraid of being ordinary," Lucas said. "I thought it would erase me. And now? Now I think ordinary might be the miracle, not the thing you settle for, the thing you earn." Charlotte considered the word. She thought of the small mercies of routine, of the generosity of a nap that arrives right when a meltdown threatens, of the way love can widen without fanfare, like daylight in a room where someone remembered to open the curtains. "Let's keep earning it," she said. In the morning, the town greeted them with a normal that had been waiting all along. Eli, taller now, asked to hold Enzo, and did so with solemn care. The sea performed its single reliable act, and the lighthouse kept turning its patient coin of light. Before they drove back to Chicago, they stopped at the railing one more time. Charlotte pressed her fingers to the carved initials and the star, then to Lucas's palm, then to Enzo's warm foot. "We told the truth," she said, "even when it was inconvenient." "And we will again," Lucas promised, not as a vow etched into stone, but as a practice they would repeat as long as breath and patience allowed. They left Brightwater with the back seat messy and the front seat full of sandwiches. The road did not become shorter because they had learned to love it. It became kinder because they were traveling it together. 3 hearts in a car, moving towards a future that would ask as much as it gave and give as much as they asked. The lighthouse disappeared in the rear view, then returned as a rumor, then was gone. The sky was busy with ordinary blue. Somewhere ahead, their apartment windows would catch the afternoon light and make a brief, useless, perfect shine on the street below. They would park and carry the baby and the bag and the new groceries. They would unlock a door. They would go in. And because love had chosen the long form with them, they would begin again.